Hello and welcome to How to Deal with Grief and Trauma. My name is Natalie Himmelrich. Today on the podcast, I'm speaking with Clover Stroud, a British journalist and author, telling us about her beautifully rich and colourful life, which also included deep trauma within her family origin. She shares about the ambiguous loss of her mother, who suffered a horse riding accident and because of it became brain damaged when Clover was only 16 years old. Her mother was alive, but no longer capable to fulfill her role as a mother. She required full-time care following her accident and died 20 years later. During those teenage years, Clover and her 2 years older sister Nell formed a close bond, as they first cared for their mother in their home. This role reversal had a huge impact on Clover's outlook on life. Not even 50, Nell was diagnosed with cancer and died within a couple of years of their mother's death. Clover believes that what saved her life was to be creating and really going after life. One of her quotes from the podcast that I will keep as a reminder of our conversation is that grief is or can be a creative act. Clover says,
I think that the trauma that I've been through has enabled me to kind of communicate this pain, the pain of being human. I think loss is so central to being a human being. It's so at the heart of what humanity is about, I think. This groundswell of loss is around us all the time. And that is, I think, the thing that we don't want to look at, but the thing that where the kind of colour and the light and the life is, not in the moments of happiness, as it were.
About this week's guest, Clover Stroud is a writer and a journalist and has 5 children. She writes about the way life feels, mining her own experience to draw a universal truth about what it means to be human. She never shies away from the big topics and writes with startling honesty about life, death, sex, addiction, motherhood, nature, grief, ecstasy, and suffering. She started her career as a journalist at 24 and since then has written regularly for all the major newspapers and publications, including the Sunday Times, the Guardian, the Daily Mail, the Telegraph, Vogue, Red, Harper's, Elle, and she frequently appears on radio or podcasts as a distinctive and singular voice. She has published 3 memoirs, all Sunday Times bestsellers, and is working on her next book. Clover hosts a weekly author interview on her popular Instagram page, Clover Stroud. I can highly recommend her page as inspirational. And also go and check out her website for details on all her memoirs. I am absolutely sure you're going to enjoy this episode today. Speaking with Clover was an inspiration as to how she sees life and how she enjoys her family. So grab a cup of tea and make yourself comfortable. Well, thank you so much for taking the time for this podcast here today. How are you doing, Clover?
It's nice to be talking to you. It's nice to be having this conversation. I've been thinking about it because it's actually my sister's 50th birthday today. She would have been 50. She died when she was 46. And she's my older sister by 2 years, and I'm now 47. And so this kind of fact of 50 is a big year, isn't it, as well? And I've been thinking a lot about her as a result of that. And so it's nice, the opportunity to talk about it. I think, I love these conversations. I think they're so important. And so I'm looking forward to talking to you about her and about my life after her as well.
Yeah, I saw that about your sister's birthday. So I think it's a nice way to, talk about her and keep her memory. And people with losses often feel that people are forgotten afterwards, which they are not. So why don't we start with you telling us a little bit about your story of loss and trauma in your life?
So I had a very, I'm the youngest of 5 children, and my sister Nell and I were the 2 youngest with 3 much older siblings. And we grew up in the south of England in a very kind of near Oxford, in a very, very English, very kind of bohemian, I suppose, very relaxed, creative household. My dad was a TV director. My mum was a stay-at-home mom with, lots of kids. And It was a really beautiful childhood. I was very, very lucky to have a very beautiful, deeply, deeply loved childhood. And my mum and my dad, but specifically my mum, made me feel deeply, deeply loved and cared for and close to her, really, really close to her. And I think that this is something that's helped me so much in my life, going through the sort of big losses that I've had. And something I'm very mindful with my own children as a result as well. The protection that a loving childhood gives you is so valuable. But we so it was a privileged, happy childhood. And then when I was 16, my mum, we grew up in the English countryside. We had ponies, we rode. And then when I was 16, I was doing my A-levels at school, and I went to school one morning, and Mum went out riding. She often went riding. We had horses. And that day she fell off her horse onto some concrete on an airfield. And she was wearing a riding hat, but she was immediately unconscious, and she was in a coma for kind of 3 to 4 months. And she had many operations to remove blood clots from her brain. And it was a very, very, very traumatic, sudden loss of her. But she was in this coma for 3 or 4 months. And as she waking up from a coma is also a gradual thing. In movies, you see it as, somebody suddenly wakes up and knows what's going on. It's not like that. It's a slow, torturous process.
Okay.
And Mum had to have like her skull cut open, and her face, physically, she was completely changed. But when she woke up, she was very, very profoundly brain damaged, and she couldn't walk very well. She could walk a little bit to start with. She couldn't talk. She didn't know who we were. She was doubly incontinent. She couldn't feed herself. She couldn't do anything. And Nell and I were at school at that time, and we tried having her living at home. My dad was away a lot. He was working, and so me and Nell were these 2 teenage girls living in this, big, quite ramshackle house in the English countryside, and looking after our mum, who was brain damaged. But it became really clear that she needed specialist nursing care. So after 2 years, she went into a nursing home, and she was then in a nursing home for another 20 years. So she lived until I was in my late 30s. So all the way through my adolescence, all the way through my 20s, all the way through, I think I was about 36. She was, no, I was 38. She was alive, but dead as well, because she wasn't able to communicate. And it makes you realize how central the ability to communicate in some way or another is. It's so critical to everything, really. And it was obviously very, very traumatic seeing her in this state where she had been this very loving maternal mother in a kitchen, a bit like my kitchen that I'm sitting in now. In fact, I'm sitting at her kitchen table. This is her table that we use. Like me, she had lots of dogs and children and colors, and she was a big, vibrant woman. And suddenly she couldn't do anything at all. And she was very, very physically and mentally disabled. And so that was the sort of bedrock of trauma, I suppose, that happened it happened when I was 16. And I think because I was so young, and also at that formative moment in my life, this kind of traumatized response went through me. And I think that, and I used it. I didn't realize really at the time, but now I understand that it became something very motivating for me and Nell as well. Nell had a deeply creative life, and she made her own circus. That was what she loved. She loved circus. She was obsessed by it. She'd worked in a circus in Germany called Circus Roncalli, and she was obsessed by the beauty of performance in the circus. And I had a life of, or am having a life of, I went kind of towards a lot of action, and I found myself taking myself off into dangerous kind of places, usually related to horses. I love horses. And so I found myself going off to Texas and finding a ranch and riding in rodeos and going and living with travelers in Ireland, traveling with horses, and going to Russia, having a relationship with this guy in Russia in the Caucasus Mountains. And during this time, I also had 5 children. I got married, I got divorced, had 2 children, got divorced, did lots of wild things, had another 3 children. And then mum died and so Nell and I went through this together. And then mum died in 2013. And then in 2015, hardly without any moment, because when she died, although we'd been awaiting her death for a long time because she was on death's door, as it were, when she died, I was in a deep state of grief and shock. And it was strange because I thought that I'd been grieving her all this time. And then when she actually died, when mum actually died, there was a new grief. And it was as though she died many times. She was in this, because she was so brain damaged, it was like there was a constant death going on. And then she actually died. And then 2 years later, Nell was diagnosed with cancer, with stage 4 breast cancer, which seemed impossible after the loss of everything we'd been through, But Nell was also a young woman. She was in her early 40s. She had 2 young children. We didn't, even though it was stage 4, we thought, oh, she's going to be one of the ones who survives. And she had massive amounts of treatment and radiotherapy, chemotherapy. The cancer basically moved very quickly through her body. And every time she stopped the treatment, it moved somewhere else. And so in 2019, although her prognosis was actually quite good, her oncologist she was trialing a new drug, and he said, you've got like 5, maybe 10 years to live. So we were feeling quite jubilant, quite happy, quite excited. But she suddenly died in 2019. She got a small infection, and then I was called to hospital, and the doctor said that she had a day to live. So it was her death was incredibly rapid. She didn't have a long deterioration. She didn't, she was there. She was off doing her circus. She was in Cuba with her boyfriend. She was buying horses. She was living the very kind of outlandish life she lived, which was always highly creative and highly colourful. And then she was just suddenly dead. And that was very, very shocking. And that remains very shocking. Even I still, I can, as I talk to you about it, I can still feel a certain sense of disbelief.
Yeah.
And so this is 3 years later. And I've, the whole process of grieving, the kind of layers of grief, I suppose, of my mum, the first loss of my mum when I was 16, but then the ongoing loss of her, all the different rites of passage as a woman that I went through, leaving home. I mean, our home was, after mum's accident, the home was kind of lost anyway, but going to university, having children, getting divorced, having, all the different things that I went through as a woman were done without mum there, but not dead either, there, but in a very distant, very damaged way. And so that was very, very, very traumatic. That was as though, I've described it before as though somebody, on an old-fashioned tape machine, you press down on pause, and the pause button is kind of grief and trauma. You hold it still, and it's the bass note of everything. And then Nell as well, that seemed impossible. But there are, there have been other traumas as well, other losses, but everything else, even deaths, even divorces, even terrible things that have happened, because we are a family who a lot has happened to. What happened to Nell and mum is the kind of the base of it all, I suppose, in some way. That defines the loss, and it also defines the kind of transformation and growth as well. Because I do think, because trauma has been such a part of my life since I was so young, I have had to use it as a way of transformation as well. That's what I do in my writing. I've written 3 memoirs now about all of this. I'm writing a fourth. I write about life experiences. I'm really, really fascinated by what we are actually, what us as normal people, as it were, not celebrities, not people who are wildly successful, not people with much stuff, but just normal people, how we experience life, what we feel, why we make the decisions we make, why our lives feel, why we feel longing or lust or pain, despair, what those feelings are. And I think that the trauma that I've been through has enabled me to kind of communicate this pain, the pain of being human. I think loss is so central to being a human being. It's so at the heart of what humanity is about, I think. And we sort of, partly because of social media, we think that, and the idea of all the platitudes of social media, living your best life, or you got this, or just all the rubbish about the kind of positive affirmations, when this groundswell of loss is around us all the time. And that is, I think, the thing that we don't want to look at, but the thing that where the kind of color and the light and the life is, not in the moments of happiness, as it were, which are fleeting, sometimes a little bit empty as well.
I agree. Yeah. It's like as if it's one part is totally grayed out as to the human experience. I mean, for me, as you know, loss is also very close to my heart, loss and trauma. And I think it makes the color, it makes the amplitude on both sides so rich.
Yeah.
And I have found that my losses, my trauma have given me so much capacity to see the full gamut, because really on the other side of birth is death. That's a given. But so much of life we're trying to avoid or to gray out the area of mortality. And I think your loss in terms of your mother is very specific and very interesting in the sense as to, you're describing her to be alive, but also death. And then I don't know if it belongs into the category of ambiguous loss, where people, for example, have lost someone, but they don't know where they are.
Yeah.
They might have gone missing, or they actually don't know.
Yeah.
Or teenagers who've become totally estranged to the family, but are still there, but not in a way reachable. And just from what you were sharing so far, it seems that the relationship that you had with your mother prior to her accident completely changed, obviously, but also a lot of the quality and the depth and the beauty was lost through her disability.
Yeah, I think it's really interesting, that idea of what kind of a loss it is, because it wasn't. I mean, I'm quite clear that obviously when she had her accident, we wanted her to survive. We wanted we wanted her to live, and she was not much older than I am now. She was 52. I'm going to be 48 this year, and she'd been there that morning and then making breakfast and chatting, and then so we really wanted her to survive the accident. But now, and it took me about 10 years to understand this and to be able to say the words, it would have been better if she'd died. It would have been better for her. It would have been much less suffering, and the physical and mental torment that she went through, first of all, would have been better if she had died. For her wider family, the suffering that we went through as well, death would have had a process which was, because there is a process to grieving and loss, and it would have been more, I don't want to use the word straightforward, but because grief isn't straightforward, but it would have been kind of clearer, I suppose. And I think that the loss of her, I wrote about her and what happened to her in my first book, which is called The Wild Other. And it's about that, everything that I went through, and trying to find her and trying to kind of locate her, and how I reacted to the kind of loss of her. And lots of people have actually contacted me who, for example, are estranged from a parent, or who have somebody who had a brother with very extreme mental illness, so she can't really be close to him. And people have said, what the way that you wrote helped me to understand and kind of feel closer to my own experience as well. And so I think that loss it was I don't know the actual psychological terms for it, but it was a complex loss, definitely. And that is it's different. It's different to what I have gone through. I'm going through with the death of my sister as well. It's a different thing.
So share a little bit. I mean, you said before already that you were 16 and for the first 2 years you and Nell were taking care of your mom at home at the same time, and as also grieving the loss of the kind of relationship that you had with your mom. How did you deal with that change and the losses of who she was early on?
I mean, when I look back at that period of time, and it was the 90s, it was like the early 90s. So the stuff that was on offer in terms of support for somebody dealing with grief, loss, trauma was much less than it is now. There wasn't really so much of the language. And we weren't given any therapy or anything like that. And mum was at home. I mean, it was a very bizarre time. It was very, very bizarre. My dad did his best, but he also had to continue working because he had, the house and our lives to kind of continue to support. And so Nell and I were at home. There were like nurses who would come in. Like sometimes it was a lady who was like a friend of my mum's might come and stay with us and help for a while, or an Australian girl came and lived with us for a bit and helped with the cooking and things like that. When it became clear that this was too much for two teenagers to be dealing with, because also I was doing my A-levels, I was applying to university. It was it was a completely bizarre time. And when I look back on it, I feel quite confused about it because, I have a 19-year-old and a 22-year-old, and the idea that they would have gone through that, knowing what they went through as teenagers with me here as a loving, supportive mother, and how difficult it was for them. Teenage life on its own.
Exactly.
Just being a teenager.
That's enough.
But dealing with it with the loss of your mother. And it was horrific. It was a horrific time. At the same time, Nell and I were two teenagers living in a big house with no parents around to say, do this, do that, go to bed. We also had a really, really out of control wild time. We were like taking drugs and have boyfriends and partying. And then also, but I think to deal with what we were going through. So it was a very, very strange, unbalanced time of loss and heightened emotion. And yet we got through it. Nell then went to university. I got a place at Oxford. We did get through it. And then as soon as I finished my A-levels, I had some time off before university. I left the home and Nell left the home, and then the home was sold, and we were, mum was in a nursing home and Nell was at university, and then she was starting circuses and I was doing different bits of traveling, and then at university. So we didn't have a home from the age of, literally the home was gone from when I was 18, it was sold. So it was Nell and I talked about it not a few months before she died. We had a big conversation about it, and it was a very, very dark, awful time. And sometimes I find it hard to really remember what it was like. I don't know. Maybe it's hard to remember what your life was really like when you were 18, 19, what you were doing day to day, but it just seems so bizarre and so strange. And I think it did, though, give Nell and I both a kind of heightened sense of wanting to do a lot of stuff, wanting to fill our lives with a lot of stuff. We survived by creating, I think, and we survived by really going for life and reaching for life, because the reality of your mother suddenly being at home, changing her nappies in the kitchen where you had been a year before, having a beautiful breakfast before school with her, and she can't talk. And that is it's a horrible, horrible, horrible thing to deal with. And the level of confusion around who that person was and the beauty of the life that you had before, the loss of the beauty of the life is, it really hurts me thinking about it. Talking to you now, I can feel a desire to cry because it's the loss was so, it was just so intense. And I think that it kind of, because I was 16, I think it sort of went into my DNA. It became my bone marrow. It became the essence of who I am, this kind of ability to deal with a lot of things. I have 5 children. I decided to bring that level of chaos. Children are chaotic. I decided to bring 5 children into my life and create a life which is demanding, highly demanding. And I think it's partly as a kind of reaction to traumatic loss and grief. And Nell created a fantastically beautiful circus. It was an unusual thing to do. And I think that trauma made us reach for life, and it made us want to create life. And so for me, it hasn't been because it's so integral to who I am, because I can't imagine my life without it, because it's been there since I was 16 nonstop. And I think it has made me create a life that is more rich, more colourful, more full of experience and people and emotion. But then again, I don't know what my life would be like. My mum could still be alive. My sister could still be alive. There is another path when mum didn't fall off her horse and Nell didn't get cancer, and they're both alive. And I've come into this kitchen to have a cup of tea with them on a Tuesday morning. There's that life as well. And sometimes you look at that life and you think, what would that have been like? Would we have both done what we did? Would we have both created the lives that we did? And that's an actually unanswerable question. I don't know the answer to that question. People have asked me before, if your mum's accident hadn't happened, would you have gone on and done all the things that you and Nell did? I don't know the answer to that. Maybe we would have done, because we were encouraged to be creative as children, but I think it did supercharge something, some kind of activity, some need to assert our own feelings of being alive, of a liveliness in the face of kind of unending grief, I suppose. And I think actually that's what's happened to me since Nell died. I'm really interested, by the way, and I'd be interested to know what you think about this, but that grief can be a creative act, and you see people transforming their life, after the most horrendous loss of a beloved life partner, of a sibling, of even of a child, like people, which I think is the most, obviously that is the most terrifying kind of loss. I do think there's a sort of hierarchy, not a hierarchy exactly, but the idea of losing your child is the most difficult. But that you see people in circumstances which feel beyond bearing, beyond living through. You see people living, and you see people moving forward and transforming themselves and finding joy and finding color and finding creativity. And I sometimes think that is because of the grief and loss that is so central to the way that we all live, and that when it happens to you, it does, it changes you in a really profound way. And I think that my life has become, Nell's death has been so awful. It's been so horrifying and so beyond belief, really, that she, after losing mum, that she in her 40s should not be here now, that she's not here to chat to have a laugh with, to have an argument with, to be a sister with. Sometimes that just seems, I'd feel dizzy with the sense of that. And maybe to push that dizziness away, to kind of keep it at bay, to keep the kind of colliding plates of your life from just colliding in and destroying you. You sort of push through them and create. And I think I can feel myself doing that more because of my sister's death, not despite it.
In response to what you were saying, I mean, I see a lot of clients and also people that I interview for the podcast who have done something after their loss. And, there's a tricky thing about because of their loss, because people would obviously want to give everything that they can not to have the loss experience. But the life is the way it is. There's no returning to option A. Yeah. The way I would describe it is that we are given an opportunity here. Grief is like this window of opportunity, or loss is this window of opportunity to experience more than before. More pain, more longing, but also, in my case, more attention to simple beauty. That was my experience, and a lot of people expressed that, as to things have been happening alongside or sort of parallel to their life, when suddenly it's like you're stopped in your track, like a car accident, and suddenly say, okay, hold on, what's been happening? So there's this chance. It's like an offering, like a gift. And how people take it and what people do out of it, that's the individual way that people are able to or willing to do it. Some people get stuck in their grief. They find it hard to move out of it or with it or integrated it back into their life, when I think it is possible. But some people actually need guidance for that. It's not a given. We are made to grieve, and we are made to, let's call it, survive the loss of significant people in our lives. But just like with anything, some people need guidance. It's not like you just have to do it on your own. But not all people take that guidance or search for that guidance, or, whatever way that they need it. So I really think it as a gift, as a chance or an opportunity, and what you do with it is individual. However, also the aspect of trauma, and I just spoke about that previously with someone, that does something to the nervous system that could leave the nervous system on high alert or on higher alert and keep it there as a predominant way of being. And that leads to, in certain cases, to people recreating the trauma in terms of searching out experiences. You mentioned a little bit about that. I don't want to put that into that box, but it could be. Some people go and search out exactly those kind of situations that led to a trauma. That's a kind of trauma response. It's called the trauma vortex, where people go to. So some people either stay in immobilization. That's where I would call it the chronic, the stuck grief, or they, on the other side, go into hypermobilization and act, do. So there's common responses, but again, it's depending on what the person also does with their life, on how they integrate it into their life. And, I see from your story as well, the relationship that you had with Nell just through the loss of your mother, in terms of the loss of her accident and the loss of the mother figure that you had in your life. Because really, you were forced at 16 to take on a different role. So you were the caretaker then. Yeah. And so that relationship, or that role that you and Nell took, potentially also made a significant difference in the relating between you. You both were at home. I heard you were the only two left at home.
Yeah, our other siblings were, they were married and they had children, and they did a lot as well, but they also had their own lives with their own children, and it's really a different experience if you're still at home and you're an adolescent. It's just, my older sister's like 15 years older than me, so she was in her late 30s when it happened. And I think that it kind of bound Nell and I together. And I mean, that's one of the things that I really, really miss about her, is being able to, because there is nobody else alive who understands what we went through, or who was there. I mean, that's not anybody else's fault, or, it's just the fact that the ones who went through that together. And so I think with sibling loss as well, there's that feeling of a loss of your very specific experience. There's nobody else in your life if you have a sibling who you are quite close to, who has like known you since you were a baby and who has like shared your clothes, your pajamas, your bath, has breathed the same air that you breathe as a little child. I think of me and Nell as like little children lying in beds. We slept in the same bedroom, like learning to talk together. Nobody else has had that. And it's the same, this very strange and specific thing we went through. And I miss a lot talking to her about that. And I think that that's the thing that you mentioned before, is that when the loss happens, that you want to go backwards, you want to go back to the life that you had before. You would do anything to change, to swap. But the fact is you can't. This is your life. This is your precious, one wild and precious life. And that feeling exactly of what you said, it's how you respond and what you do at that point. And I think that Nell and I, we were sisters. We also had a really normal sister relationship, which is tempestuous and full of arguments and fights. We could afford to have fights like that because we were sisters. I wouldn't fight with a friend like that, because you just end up without a friendship, basically. Whereas sisters, you can. And I think that, I wouldn't say that either of us like mothered the other one at all. We were there pretty much as equals together. She was a bit older than me, and obviously to an older sister, being older is really important. And there was always that feeling of her being a bit older than me. But yeah, it was a very, very strange time, and it feels strange that I'm the kind of, my dad is alive and I'm very, very close to my dad, and I talk to my dad a lot. But the actual witness to what happened to Mum, it was me and Nell together, I suppose. Yeah, the loss it's just a profound loss.
So looking back to both of those significant losses, what do you think, what resources and insight would have helped you the most? Or are helping you still?
Are helping, yeah. I think that the kind of, I've learned so much more about grief in the last 3 years since Nell died, and the way it transforms life. And I wish I'd sort of understood more about feeling all the outside edges of it. And this is a difficult thing to kind of say to somebody who is recently bereaved, which is that, and I've written about this in my new book. So I wrote a book after Nell died called The Red of My Blood, which is about the first year after she died, because I wanted to, in the first few weeks and few months, I was aware of being taken, flung unwillingly, very unwillingly, into an other different state, which I didn't want to be in, but which was extraordinary. It was not ordinary. It was highly kind of awakened, highly, highly painful, like lying on a knife all the time. It's excruciatingly painful, physically demanding, physically disorientating. And yet I was aware that was an interesting state to be in. That wasn't a normal state. And a few months after she died, I realized I want to know what happens in grieving. Where am I going to go on feeling like this, as though I'm going to die and I can't live? And how do I go on living? And what is this process? And so I suppose that writing about it made me reflect a lot on what that process felt like. And in my book, I really tried to describe exactly what grief feels like, and how emotionally, physically, spiritually disorientating and extraordinary it is. And I suppose I'm really interested by something you just said, like, we are made to survive the loss of people we love. We are made to survive grief. I think that's a really, really key thing that's important to know, and that you will endure, you will survive this, this process will change. And you have to obviously be really sensitive to people in the early stages of grief, because they might not want to hear that, or they might think that you're being, you're dismissing something, which you're not at all. But somebody did say to me after Nell died, when I was just lying in bed in a completely wrecked state, like, it will change, it will change. And having faith in that process, and having faith in the forward movement of time, and the more forward movement of yourself with that time. And I think there's something really sacred about grief. I wish I'd known more about the sacred space, the sacred state that you are in, and that how, because of the pain, not despite the pain, because of the pain, it is also a marvelous kind of place to be, where you see the world in different ways.
Exactly.
You have an ability to kind of touch the outer edges of it, and to not see through the veil, but to feel all the edges of your life, not just the days of your life. And I am really interested by that, and the way that the world, colors. There's a lot of color in my book. It's a very dazzling book, because I felt very kind of dazzled by, you like an image of somebody suddenly walking into a bright light, like you have your hands up in front of your face. It's almost like that. It's so dazzling, and it is also destroying. So you feel as though your bones are broken, you need to lie on the floor. It is those things at the same time, and kind of being alert to those feelings, and being, if it's possible, I mean, it's so hard, but being kind of brave in those feelings, knowing that the feelings will happen to you, and allowing them to happen to you, allowing the waves of grief to kind of really, really hit you, rather than resisting them. And sometimes you have to resist them because something is happening in life. You've got to drive a car, or, talk to somebody about something. But if you can allow the feelings into you, because it's also, like water rushing into a cave, it's sort of like cleansing as well. And the beauty of that. But it's a difficult thing to, someone who's recently bereaved might not want to hear that too.
Yeah. All that you were saying just reminded me of a couple of memories that I have with my mother before she died. And one of them was when I was 19 weeks pregnant, my mother had one of her suicide attempts. And after that, speaking to her, I was so angry. So at that time, I said to her, "How could you?" And she said, very nonchalant, she said, "Well, I knew that at the beginning it would be hard to grieve my loss, but with time it would get easier." I'm like, well, for me to hear it at that time, when she wanted to kill herself, but she didn't, or it didn't end with that, I was, But looking back now, it was 11 years on the 19th of January. Looking back, I say, well, she was right. So in that, I don't want to say that time heals all wound. No, it's not that. But with time, it becomes different. It becomes easier. That is my experience. I don't want to put it on anyone else, but it is my experience. And I think also in retrospect, from what you were saying in terms of the amount of grief, there is an aspect of trauma that is important to understand, is to titrate also with the grief. And for some people, letting the grief wave hit, if they can, it's a beautiful thing to do, because there is a transformative way with allowing the grief energy to move through you. Mm-hmm. However, one needs to be individually sensitive as to what is possible for me not to be swept away. Yeah. I always have the image of the dam, and the dam is the water stopped, and but it lets out a little bit, so that it doesn't overflow. So if the dam wasn't there, and in the beginning of grief, that's the numbness and the shock. Yeah. If the dam wasn't there, the whole village down the valley would be flooded. Yeah. But you still need to let certain amounts through. And if if the dam gets higher, the dam people, I don't know what you call it, they have to let down more water, because otherwise this is going to be a disaster, right? In some form or another. But I think it's the individual that needs to learn of, how do I deal with the amount of grief, the amount of water in the dam that is here? How do I deal with that? Yeah. And there's such a beauty and energy and potent energy of allowing that grief to pass through you.
Yeah.
And yes, it is painful. There is no way that you can talk it nice. Grief is an intense, the metaphor that is used, grief is like running a marathon daily. That's on a physical level, that the way that they describe it's not just a metaphor, it's actually an explanation of the physical intensity of loss. Well, I think we could talk so much more. It's been so interesting talking to you, but given the size of or the amount of time that we usually spend on the podcast, I want to bring it to rounded end here. Would it be okay to finish with the rapid fire question?
Yeah, absolutely.
So grieving and trauma means?
Life, to me, it is central to life. It is living. I think life is a series of losses, and they go absolutely together, and therefore it's not something to be terrified by, but to live amongst, live with.
And healing means?
Healing means creating for me. Creating has been, whether that's my home, my work, my children, it might just be in a single day, like the way that I go outside and experience a walk, for example, through a field or a park. It doesn't have to be a huge act like writing a book or writing a poem. It could just be just the way that you inhabit your space, your life, your soul, your days in as creative a way as possible. That's central to healing, I think. That is healing.
And what I have learned about myself in the light of loss and trauma?
That I can withstand so much, that I have huge resources of strength inside me, even when I feel most broken, as do, so many of us, all of us, really. I think we have tremendous amount of fortitude, tremendous amount of strength that we don't know about. And
I agree.
Grief and trauma enables us to realize that, really.
What would be one thing you wish people knew about loss and trauma?
That your life isn't ending. Your life is just growing. It's just revealing itself to you. And it might be taking you into a place that you think you don't want to go to. You think you would do anything to resist going into. But walk into it. Walk fully into it and look around. The world will reveal new views, new rooms, new people, new landscapes and cityscapes and psychological worlds which you just didn't really think were possible. It will reveal so much that is so extraordinary and beautiful to you. You'll be amazed by it.
And name one thing that has changed since your losses and your traumas that you wouldn't want to miss.
I mean, it's really difficult to think of one thing because there are so many things in my whole life. I wouldn't want to miss my whole life. But I think my creative energy, I think grief and trauma has fired up my creative energy, and I'm really grateful for that.
Thank you so much for all your wisdom and your sharing authentically. And for listeners here, please go and read some of Clover's books that are out there. I can highly recommend that. Thank you so much, Clover.
Thank you. It's been a really beautiful and important conversation. Thank you so much.
Thanks for listening to How to Deal with Grief and Trauma. If you'd like to be updated on future episodes, please subscribe to my newsletter on nataliehimmelrich.com. If you need grief support, please contact me for a 30 minutes free discovery session. How to Deal with Grief and Trauma is produced and edited by me, Natalie Himmelrich. To support this podcast, please rate, review, and subscribe to or follow the podcast on Apple, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. Thank you. And remember to keep breathing. I promise it will get easier.